Sober, the first track on In Embers, was the last track to be written. I was messing around on the guitar one day and it very quickly came together, and I recorded into Pro Tools. By that time I had my system set up so I could quickly make a recording for this album. But it wasn't until I sent it to Nick and he added those guitar embellishments that it really started to sound like a finished song, which had the potential to go first on the album. And there's ideas here, such as the use of polyrhythm, which we also explore in later tracks like Forsaken, Tides, Chemistry, and to some extent False Sun. So it really serves as a taster of what's to come. The title track of the album, In Embers, predates the band name and it predates the pandemic, and it was really the first track that Nick and myself were able to work on together, and some of that work was actually done in the studio together, laying down guitar tracks. We were able to record together and in person before coronavirus, and it's one of the only places on the album that is the case. And it really ended up being the catalyst for the whole project, hence the reason why it's ended up as the title track.
Darkness falls like the ocean's deep, delirious.
The song is almost my response to Stu's track Forsaken, and that was one of the first things that Stu showed me at the start of this process. I was immediately taken by its dark, brooding vibe. It sounded really heavy, oppressive even, and it sounded like it'd be from a heavy, dark album. So I was inspired to create a really riff-based, heavy, doomy track, but still retaining a sense of melody and movement within it. Stu's lyrical content, I think, really matched that vibe that I was going for perfectly, and for that reason I think it's become one of the more darker tracks on the record. The middle section was something that I'd had for a really long time, years even, without knowing how, if, when I was going to be able to sort of use it really, but the idea of having some ambience coming from the sonic chaos that come before it, that idea really seemed to fit in the context of this song perfectly.
That beats the light. 7 times I bled.
Forsaken, that's one of the early tracks, like In Embers, which also predates the pandemic. And the inspiration for this is I bought a delay pedal which was capable of doing long delays and holding the note behind what you're playing. That combined with a long reverb creates this synth-like tone, and that sound inspired the riff. But what really makes this track for me is it's got a dark theme, and in the middle there's this lovely bit of harmonic guitar that Nick added, which kind of lifts you up into an oasis in this otherwise gloomy atmosphere.
Tides is a song that came about from the use of altered tunings, and this is something that Stu and I have experimented with a lot throughout the songwriting process for the record. But with Tides, the guitar tuning was really different from anything that I'd used before, to the point where I didn't actually know what all the strings were tuned to. This, in effect, renders you almost a complete beginner again. You have to fumble around with alien chord shapes, and sometimes it can sound horrible, but sometimes you can hit upon something and it can be quite stirring and it just seems really right. It continually keeps the songwriting process fresh, but moreover it allows you to access sounds and chords that you wouldn't normally be able to create in a more standard tuning. This was an idea that Stu had, where it was mainly an instrumental segment, super ambient, really mournful, haunting quality to it, and we toyed with the idea of keeping it as an ambient segment to the record really, but I suggested that we try and turn it into a full track because it really leapt out at me. So Stu set up a loose structure with a drum track with gaps for a chorus and a middle eight, and it was almost like a fill in the blanks challenge. So I came up with the heavy chorus sections and sent it back to Stu, and he came up with what I think's probably one of his best vocal performances on the record. And it really brought the track together in a really cohesive way. The way we collaborated on the track was unique to the record in a lot of ways, and for that reason I think it's probably one of my favourite tracks.
Yeah, probably the most progressive sounding track on the album here with Chemistry. When I was writing this track on the acoustic guitar, I quickly realised there was this inherent tension in the vocals, and I wanted to reflect that in the music. So I adapted it from being entirely in 6/8 into having a bar of 6 and then a bar of 5 in the verses. And as a listener, you don't really notice that 12th beat missing, but it subconsciously builds tension. And then when we go back into a straight 6/8 in the chorus, that tension is then released. What we were initially going for with False Sun was to write a straightforward rock track that wasn't in a 4/4 time signature, but as the recording developed, some heavier elements crept in, and if you listen carefully you'll hear the final song is mostly in 6/4 time. And I had great fun doing vocals for this one, both in terms of the timing and how the phrases of the chorus fit within those bars of 6 beats. But also it's really the first time I tried anything more textural and guttural with my voice beyond the more melodic singing you hear on other Moth songs.
Do you ever feel like this cage had broken us again?
You've got a much more down-tempo track here in Broken. The acoustic guitar at the heart of it belongs to my brother. He lent it to me just before the pandemic hit, and as such it ended up staying with me throughout the lockdowns and became very central to my songwriting process. It wasn't until I tuned it down a whole step though that Broken really started to come into being. I, like many other songwriters, have a book of words that I take around with me and I write down ideas and notes and chords in there. I was flicking through that book one day and some of my previous lyrics jumped off the page and kind of presented themselves for this song. At that point, I didn't have the phrase "I'm broken," and it wasn't until I really started to record those vocals that that phrase suggested itself. Now, Nick and I purposely didn't set out to write a concept album here, but in terms of some of the loose themes of conflict, inner turmoil and eventual rebirth that run through in Embers, it's very much within that theme, and it's probably the song that reflects those ideas the most, along with possibly the final track, Kerosene, which coincidentally was written on the same acoustic guitar.
All my love is kerosene, kerosene.
So shortly after we'd recorded Broken, I was sitting in the studio one night playing in that tuning, and I decided to retune the guitar, and I just retuned one string and the whole chorus and riff for Kerosene just fell out of the guitar. All of that came at once, and I played it a few times through and I thought, okay, it's getting quite late now. If I can remember this tomorrow, then I'll write a verse and a bridge for it into the chorus. And I went away and I came back to the studio the next day and I picked up the guitar and it was the first thing in my head. So at that point I decided that it needed to be turned into a full song. And here it is in its acoustic version. Myself and Nick might do a different version of this in the future, but here it's just a really nice way to wrap up the album. It kind of encapsulates what the album is about in one song.